Friends, will you please pray with me? Loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing to you. For you, O God, are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. There is a quintessential question that has been passed from generation to generation, whether the asker or the askee, I am certain is a rite of passage. Of course, the range of answers has changed with the decades or with the centuries, as many things do. What do you want to be when you grow up? Do you recall what your answers were that you shared in your youth? Truthfully, I don't recall what my answer was when I was a child. I barely recall what answers I've heard from our nieces and nephews most recently. Although to be fair, it changes every single time, and there are a lot of nieces and nephews. What I do remember is that, like so many of my generation, space camp was absolutely the path forward to being an astronaut. And then at some point I thought maybe I'd be a pediatrician. But then I volunteered at Children's Hospital here in Columbus for more than a year, and I knew my heart could never handle it. I explored a couple of other options, and I've made my way through a few degrees, all of which felt okay, but never quite right. But I can also say that never in my wildest dreams would my teenage self ever have answered a pastor. Nor did any of my answers ever have anything to do with my sexuality. You see, I'm not what you would call a cradle Methodist. Although my genealogy research-loving dad has reminded me more than once that at least 2 of my great-great-great-great-grandfathers were Methodist circuit riders. Lineage aside, the truth is, most of the pastors I knew growing up were family members, but they belonged to a version of Christianity that reeked of toxicity to me, even then. One family member in particular, an uncle, had no problem with blatantly racist jokes and talk of those fairies. But the toxicity didn't end there. It filtered throughout the family and our lives. God forbid a young girl not want to wear a skirt to church, or that any child have the audacity to say no to their elders, even if the asks were unreasonable. And women? Well, women were not to be heard in worship unless it involved singing or tickling the ivories. Even if I'd had any sort of inclination to ministry at a young age, I would never have been permitted to realize it, based solely on the fact that I am a woman. As it turns out, sniffing out that odor of toxicity wasn't just me being overly sensitive. The Christianity I grew up in looked like privilege that was so busy glad-handing itself that it never occurred to anyone that there might be other hands. Different, yet fully capable and willing hands. For all sorts of reasons, I can honestly say that any given time I stand in a pulpit to preach is one of those moments in life when I could freeze frame it, show it to a younger version of myself, and wait for the loud guffaws of disbelieving laughter. Not only because I am a woman, or because I never particularly liked speaking in front of crowds, or even because I once walked away from the toxicity of the church entirely. Disbelieving laughter would be almost entirely rooted in the fact that I identify as a lesbian, an out married one at that. I suppose to half of my family, this is the gravest sin of all. And it just so happens that I was called into this Methodist denomination, which largely does better than the church I grew up in, but which continues to find itself unable, or perhaps just unwilling, to see the fullness of gender and sexuality as gifts from God. This is a truth that I knew when I came into the United Methodist Church. I knew this when our foundational theology of John Wesley struck a chord in me that continues to resonate to this day. I knew this when I answered my call to seek ordination in this denomination as an out married lesbian. But God kept leading me forward. So far, the institution as a whole has failed to fully affirm that call through its process, though individuals and committees have done so and have licensed me and granted me the status of clergy, even while this journey continues. The process of tearing down the walls of fundamentalism that has denied the sacred nature of human sexuality and gender identity is, as many of you know, an ongoing journey. Truly, although there are glimmers of hope from some, there are still plenty of reasons for each of us to persist in pushing the denomination to a healthier expression of its own identity. And thanks be to God that in the end, none of the institutional pronouncements can stop God's ongoing work in any of us. You see, whether the institution likes it or not, being authentic and true to who God made us to be, whether others are capable of seeing us or not, is as Wesleyan as we can be and as Christ-like as we can get. Because here's the thing. For all the ways that the church has been at the center of a culture war, particularly as it relates to an understanding of human sexuality and gender expression, it is often forgotten or overlooked entirely that the power of the gospel story lies in the revealed identity of Jesus, which many at the time did not fully accept or understand. Of course, that didn't change the fact that Jesus was already God incarnate well before anyone could fathom it. But it was a revelation of this truth, and it was a holy act for not only his disciples, but also for this world. For some of us, Mark's account of the Transfiguration is at least vaguely familiar, if only from a daydream. A group of friends gather in a comfortable place where they can be together, and one reveals the truth of their identity to those friends. That identity is affirmed by the presence of those who have gone before, the pioneers of the movement for God's kingdom, as it were. Jesus' once hidden, now out and transfigured self is glorious, a revelation of God's divine presence. His disciples, his friends, although completely caught off guard and unsure of how to respond, are grateful to be there, grateful to know this truth about their friend and teacher. They are in awe at the glory that rests before their eyes. In fact, they know this is something special, and Peter finds himself remarking that they should build a shrine to their friend and to those who came before him. In some of our cases, Peter's declaration is the sort of reaction we longed for, but never received. Okay, well, maybe not the shrine part, but so many who have come out embracing God-given sexuality and gender have yearned for just a shred of acceptance. But friends, whether celebrated or rejected, the revelation of our true identity, our coming out to this world, is an act grounded in Scripture, and it is a revelation of the Imago Dei, the image of God that resides within each of us. I have to imagine that even as sure in his identity as he was, knowing he was God incarnate, Jesus must have had some doubts about revealing this deeply intimate part of himself, about which speculation and derision already abounded. This was not a spontaneous bursting forth of divinity in the midst of a large gathered crowd, where no one could ever doubt again. There was forethought, clear consideration given to who Jesus would bring with him, when and where he was ready to come out and live the truth of his divinity. In this sense, those of us within the LGBTQIA+ community have an understanding of Jesus' lived experience that not everyone can ever know. Most of us have been there, sitting with the not knowing. These were disciples that Jesus trusted enough, or at least the ones who most needed to experience this truth. They could have questioned him, disappointed him, betrayed him. Possibilities that each of us within the multi-dimensional spectrum of human sexuality and gender identity and expression live with each and every time we reveal our true selves to those with whom we share this world. Because that's what people and institutions do. Praise be, it is not what God does. Gratefully, I remember that the first person I ever came out to was as thrilled and as celebratory as I could have asked for. Sitting with the not knowing, even though I knew that first person would love me no matter what, was exhausting and perhaps even a little maddening. Other times of coming out, especially with family members, went very differently and ended with rejection, both them of me and me of their church. In a way, those were expected endings because the influence of toxic Christianity is everywhere, refusing to see the holiness of coming out. To come out is not only a radical act of love for self and for God who created us, it is also an act of grace. Coming out is one way of saying to this world, I am living into the fullness of life that God has given me, and I invite you into this journey. And honestly, not everyone is ready to join at that first invitation, and some never will be. But that does not mean that God is not already present and affirming who that person is. Now, if you are not a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, though you may be an ally, I urge you to lean into what God says when Jesus is transfigured, when Jesus shares his true identity. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. When someone comes out to you, whether as a cisgender person whose sexuality is not strictly heterosexual, or as a transgender person who says the gender I am is not reflected in the body I have, or in the constructs of gender that society has foisted upon us, listen to them. Hear God saying, this is my child, the beloved. Listen to them. That person knows their true identity in a way that you can never know, and they are honoring God by loving themselves and by opening up to you. They are choosing to let their light shine in a world that has for so long taught that it is proper and righteous to keep it hidden as though it were not the light of God shining in this world. This is why the life and actions of Jesus are so powerful and relevant. Because there will always be people seeking to deny that God-given sexuality and gender identity and expression are authentic and holy revelations of the self. While Jesus' coming out was not centered around gender identity or sexuality, it was very much a risk. And it was all about honoring who he already was and letting his light shine. And it was celebrated. Peter probably wasn't that far from throwing Jesus a coming out as God party. But that wasn't his role. Did you notice the last verse of the gospel passage where Jesus instructs the disciples to tell no one until after the resurrection? The role of the disciples was to know and affirm, to honor, to believe. Jesus' role was to share who he was, knowing some would not understand or believe. By revealing his true identity to Peter, James, and John, Jesus knew those others would affirm his identity when it was questioned at a later time. This is part of why we come out too, and why it is always our role, not another's. We want to know that every time we reveal this part of who we are, someone will be there ready to say, I know their truth, and I affirm that it is good and holy. As we all know, Jesus' identity was and still is questioned, just as those of people who make up the diverse LGBTQIA+ community. The world is not always ready to see the holiness in being authentic and open to God's diverse gifts. Much of the world sits in disbelief, just as Paul described, because it is difficult to believe in something that we haven't experienced for ourselves. Thankfully, this world, this church, this denomination has had a great number of people willing to come out and live their truth, to let the light of God shine through them exactly as who God made them to be. They have, like Jesus, illumined the path for all of us who journey today. Thankfully, there have always been Peters, Jameses, and Johns who have continued to show up and journey alongside those who traversed this path before and who do so with us now. The institutions of this world will always throw stumbling blocks into the paths of those seeking to live an authentic life empowered by God's Spirit. God has given us the tools, the example, the people to continue on, pursuing the truth that our identities are reflections of God. Friends, what I can share of my own journey and the ways the world has responded to my true identity as a lesbian woman called to ordained ministry is not actually about me so much as it is about how God is at work to transform this world. You know of many others engaging in this work, of that I am certain. You know because you have been entrusted with the truth of identity. Perhaps you are the one who has, time and again, had to share your truth with another. Whether gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, transgender, agender, non-binary, or any other expression of sexuality or gender, your acceptance of and living into your identity is an act of love. Love yourself and embrace the you that God made you to be. For love is holy, and love is of God. Continue to invite others into your truth and offer them that grace of knowing your fullness. Coming out is powerful, holy work, and yes, it is exhausting and painful at times. But the more we are empowered by God's loving Spirit to come out, the more the world sees us and sees through us, in us, the fullness of God shining through, and the more they see that God is at work through us, transforming us, transforming the hearts and minds of others. So my friends, on whatever day it is, and wherever you find yourself, come out, wherever you are. For wherever you are, God is always with you and within you, making you holy. Thanks be to God.